On today's episode of Powerview, we'll be discussing our part 2 of the tax conversation, focusing around the reasons for why we have taxes, as well as looking at why we should, or why not we should pay income taxes. As always, I'm Braden, he's Jordan. Together, we are the Realist Idealists, and this is Powerview. So, like we mentioned in our introduction, we're going to discuss taxes for our second part of our series. And in particular, we thought the best place to start before we get into the question of should we pay income taxes is really looking at the reasons for why we have taxes in general in the first place, right? So, if you haven't watched our episode that came before this, definitely feel free to do that because it discusses kind of the main overarching different types of taxes that our societies and our governments use today. So what we really want to look at right now is the reason why we have those. So one of those reasons are to pay for services that may not automatically be funded, right? So that can be things like schools or healthcare, military, infrastructure, environment, government institutions, right? Those are all things that don't necessarily have a capitalist value, right? A market capitalist value. So you wouldn't automatically, unless you were talking about things that are privatized versions of those, right? So obviously there are private healthcare, there's private schools, military, right? Environmental regulations, even potentially you could have a private versions of those. But they don't necessarily scale the way that ideally a society would want to have them in comparison to when a government oversees those things. And I'm not trying to say that governments are perfect in their spending with those kind of budgets. But to create a system that helps the most amount of people, normally the government would be the best kind of organization, I guess. Yeah, institution to implement those things, especially I think when it comes to infrastructure, right? There's lots of things like, I don't know, the like street lights or like traffic lights, right? Something like that is paid for by taxes. And the reality is none of us, or there's probably it's very unlikely that a company is going to come along and kind of build traffic lights, right?
Be that generous,
yeah, because there's not a direct economic value
for
that
them
they
to
can
do
receive for doing that, right?
Correct, yeah. Whereas the
Yeah.
government can employ people to maintain it, and then
Mm-hmm.
those people are then in turn paid from collecting taxes.
Yeah, right. Because like obviously it still is providing jobs and someone is still making money off of it. You're buying the parts to do those things, but the end result of having that traffic light really, unless we were on like a toll road type of thing, which you could make the argument is a tax in itself,
Yeah.
you're really you're not going to have too many people signing up to implement those things within society, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of like our first point for why we have taxes today. Our second point is arguably one of the bigger points, but also I think one of the points that I think the vast majority of us think about when it comes to taxes. And that's the idea of redistributing wealth between economic classes, right? So this is the idea that you're kind of taking wealth from the like upper and middle class and trying to redistribute it to the bottom, right?
Yeah.
So that's in particular kind of connected with our like kind of social services and things like that. Different aid packages that governments put out. All those things are kind of connected with this idea of how do we make things a little bit more fair, or maybe not even fair, but how do we support the people that are
Accessible.
struggling
Yeah.
the most? Yeah. Right. Um, and yeah, so redistribution of wealth is, it's connected to probably all parts of taxes. Um, but I think for a lot of us, when we think of our taxes, we
Thinking of
think about this idea of, yeah, how can we fund our,
like day to day.
yeah, well,
Oh,
because like,
you're thinking of, okay, like I'm thinking of infrastructure. So like,
well, no, so I was going to say, kind of connected with that, right? Like,
yeah,
so if you had a private school, right?
yeah,
Obviously, if schools were all private, which they are in some places, um, you will have to pay into that system. If you can't pay into that
you don't
system,
get access to it. Yeah,
then you wouldn't get access to it, right?
yeah,
So this idea of redistributing wealth so that someone who can't afford healthcare, can't afford education, can't afford whatever, you're taking it ideally from those who have and giving it to those who have not, right? Like that don't have that ability. Um, Hopefully that makes sense. It's pretty common sense, but I know I probably convoluted it way
no,
way
no,
more
but
than
like
it needed to
when
be.
you look at like the history of, like, if you go back to like, I guess it'd be 13th century England, where like most of our like modern taxes kind of came from, I guess.
Yep. Yep.
Like it was a very much like a I don't want to say barter system, but it was very much like a you provide this, I provide this kind of deal. So it's like
Yeah, the
all the
give and take
villagers
kind of thing,
would,
right?
yeah, collect their harvest, they would sell all their stuff, and then they pay a certain amount to the local lord, and then he would then in turn protect them from, not, it might not even be things like other people, it could just be like,
from the
700
Lord
years ago,
itself. Yeah.
yeah, or like wolves.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
just stuff like
Just
that. It's
your
like, okay,
environment. Yeah.
well then, yeah, we'll provide, like, we'll bring in dogs and guys that walk around the village at night, and then
Hmm.
you don't worry about like wolves dragging your like sheep and stuff that then affects the rest of the village.
Yeah.
Now,
No,
obviously, it's
definitely.
evolved since then to be a little bit more than that. But like you said, now we have things like civil services that and infrastructure that take a little bit to upkeep. Like in terms of the population, you have
Hmm.
just something simple as water treatment, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Is a big one,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Where it in itself does not provide like the end result doesn't have anything that you can kind of sell back to society type of
well,
thing.
yeah, and where we live, because yeah, you've been to Hamilton, so like
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
like you go through there and you're like, oh yeah, we pay all this taxes. You guys think you can, like, air a Febreze out over the water
Mm,
treatment plant?
yeah. Tidy up a
Well,
bit.
I think it was what, last year at some point, and they realized that there was that sewage pipe leaking into Hamilton Harbor.
Yeah, I did hear something about that.
Yeah. And like I just thought it was funny because I'm like, wait, you guys haven't smelt that for the last 20 years
Yeah.
driving over this lake? I felt like we all knew.
Yeah.
Like,
I think we all knew it was just
there's
the fact
something
that
weird going
like,
on. Yeah.
yeah, the accepting that like, oh well, there's so many things that are already messed up. Like
Yeah.
it can't be that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no way. Yeah.
But yeah, nevertheless, that's kind of like in a bit of a, hopefully a nutshell. The redistributing of wealth is our second overarching point, and kind of our third. And I do want to preface, there are other reasons for why we have taxes besides the three that we're going to name today. But these were kind of three that we thought were important enough and kind of covered the basis for a lot of the reasons.
That we all have
And
some kind of, I guess, interaction with on somewhat of a daily
yeah,
basis,
yeah,
right?
the
Yeah.
vast majority of us have that connection, right? Um, and so yeah, our kind of point number three is used to is that taxes are used to deter certain purchases or behaviors, right? So there are taxes on like cigarettes that are special, right? Or we have nowadays the big like one that everyone talks about is the carbon tax, right? Like a gas
Yeah,
tax.
there's Freon's another one too, and refrigerant.
Yep. Yeah. So
Because they
different
change it so often
environmental
that, yeah,
taxes.
once
Yeah.
they're like, oh, here's a new better one, and if you're still using the old one, you pay more of a tax for using it after a
Yeah.
certain point. So it's like
Yeah.
you have till this date, and then if you're still carrying after that date and you need to, like, say the system you're running still needs that one, then you have to pay more to get it.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So kind of environmental taxes as a whole, because I'm sure there's even others besides the two that we just mentioned there. Um,
Oh
foreign
god.
goods, right? Like, so obviously we talked about this in the last episode, but the idea of tariffs, but even just like importing taxes as a whole, right? Like it could be
Yeah.
on specialized goods or
Yeah.
goods that we sell here that we don't want you to buy from outside. Sorry, what were you going to say, Jordan?
No. Just extreme example of that would be like
Yep.
exotic pets in parts of the states.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure that there's like taxes on things like
Yeah,
that.
because like I know like there's like so many tigers in captivity in Texas, and it's
Yeah.
because like in
Yeah.
that state you pay a lower like exotic pet tax or something like that, right?
Okay. There you
Yeah,
go.
which is kind of so there's just tigers.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure that's really safe, right? Oh man. Um we've all seen Tiger Kings. Um but yeah, hopefully that kind of gives you a bit of a sense of just in general why we have taxes, right? Because I think a lot of people at face value, um, maybe this isn't necessarily fair, but I think a lot of us kind of get annoyed about taxes, right? Because of course
Yeah,
it's a feels at times like a burden that we pay taxes in whatever capacity, right? Um, but there are reasons for why we have taxes, right? It pays for a lot of services, whatever, maintaining roads, all that kind of stuff. It's the idea of helping out those who maybe can't help themselves as well, and then right, like we said, deterring certain behaviors, right? That one obviously I think is maybe at times seen as the most controversial, right? um
it's also probably the least applied too when you think about it.
Definitely as a whole, right? Because there's not
Yeah,
so many behaviors that are covered or like
yeah, I
controlled
don't.
by the government, which is a
Yeah,
good thing, right? Because we do want to have the freedom to make those choices. um but it is like I think like cigarettes are one of those ones where it feels like, how can you control my decision to smoke cigarettes, but at the same time the burden on like the healthcare system, right? If you have
yeah.
like
Well, that's
whatever,
why
if
they
it's
tax
the
smokers more.
1950s and ever, yeah, right, yeah. So like if everyone would, like back in the day when everyone smoked cigarettes, right? How do we
Well, and
kind of,
that's the thing,
yeah,
right? And people are like in New Zealand, they have it like in places like New Zealand, and maybe in Ontario it's a little different because we also control the government also earns all the money on the liquor sales,
yep,
which
yeah,
is a little bit different. But when you think about how much money comes from like cigarette tax that goes back into
hmm,
the system, like smokers
yeah,
pay for a lot of the stuff
a
in
lot,
society. Yeah,
yes, yeah.
and rightfully so. But like,
Yeah.
you want to talk about inflation, smokers have been dealing with that for 20 years. So
Yeah. 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 There's a lot of pressure to stop people from smoking. And it
yeah,
comes mainly in the form of pressure on your wallet, right? Like
yes, but
it's like,
in
I'm
one
going to
way
make it so you
it
can't
is a good
afford.
it is a good tax revenue for like the government in that sense, where then they get enough, like they
Yeah,
get a ton of money they can put towards other stuff. It's not good,
definitely.
but
Yeah.
yeah,
And
it's
I
a
think
catch
that
22.
actually even somewhat leads us to our next part of the conversation, but I don't want to go necessarily, you don't have to go right into that part, but I think a lot of times when we're looking at taxes, um, and trying to ask ourselves, should we have to pay taxes? Should we pay more taxes? Should we pay less taxes? Right? Um, a lot of times it gets connected back to what is the tax money being spent on, right? In terms of
Yes.
like how we feel about that.
Yep.
And I think we're going to explore that, but in particular, we're going to try to focus on income taxes, right? Because there are lots of different types of taxes. I mean, in the previous episode, we had like 7 different taxes that we talked about. Um, but income taxes, I think, are what a lot of people focus on when it comes to kind of tax reform and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You hear a lot about in the media that tax the rich and all those kind of things. Those are all very much so related to income tax, right?
Yeah.
I know for anyone who earns a paycheck, right? Your income tax, that's your livelihood, so to speak, right? Like that's where you uh, are either going to struggle or or you're going to be able to maybe tweak some things to allow yourself to have a bit of a better standard of living, right? Depending
Yeah.
on things, right? So yeah, Jordan, I don't know if it's cool with you if you want to start this conversation around income taxes in particular and just however you want to approach it, right? But focusing on this idea of like, should we pay taxes at all on income taxes on our income? Should we pay less? Should we pay more? And then we can kind of also dive into this idea of uh,
Yeah. Well,
what are we spending the money on, type of
yeah.
thing.
Well, I think it's important to know too, like,
Yeah.
to look at where it came from, because income tax is still relatively recent in Western society
Mm-hmm.
in terms of
Yeah.
it came out of, and a lot of people don't realize is that during the First World War, we needed to pay to put millions of soldiers in boots and some food and ammunition, and that led to what we will probably all remember from like Great Times war bonds.
Mm-hmm.
And those eventually became, after I think it was the Second World War, they became institutionalized as what we know today as income tax.
Yeah. I
Because
think even income taxes started not necessarily in Canada earlier, but didn't it in the States? Isn't it either? I do apologize because I
no,
don't
no,
know
no,
this
no,
fact
it's
off the top of my head, but it's
just digging it up
either
too.
the American Revolution or the Civil War, one or the other. They
Yeah,
temporarily did income
I
taxes.
think it was the Civil War. Don't quote me on it right now
I
because
think
I
you're
don't
right
want to
because I think
start.
it's Lincoln who
Yeah, my keyboard's been
imp-
acting up a little. So,
implemented. Yeah, you don't need to look it up. Everybody,
yeah,
you
but
get the
yeah, there
idea that
was
it's not always been the case, right? Yeah,
correct. Yeah, it's come
yeah,
from somewhere, and now obviously in the last 100 years, there's been a lot more social services that have evolved, right? As
yes,
well, in
yeah,
terms of providing a better standard of living.
yeah.
But
That's
yeah,
a fair
that's
important to note because
yeah. But it
that
is
is very true.
it is just interesting. I always am fascinated. I'm like, wait, so this money is coming off my check because we were at war, which obviously that's a very big oversimplification of it. But
Yeah, it's
it,
maybe not the argument of why you're paying it today, but
no,
it's why
no,
it came out,
in
why
the
they
first
thought it might
place,
be an
yeah,
idea in the first place. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. And like they're saying today, there's obviously more stuff to pay for in terms of like social services
yeah,
and stuff that have like come along since that time. But then it's like we were also going to get into that a little bit later about how that money's spent per se. But
yes,
also as
yeah,
well, you have like the because you also have consumer tax, right? Which you like you and I go out to choose to buy something, we get taxed on it.
hmm
Whereas but the thing is like you have to buy something, right? Like you need to buy groceries. Like even though like say like I'm not maybe a shopper, like I won't go out and like, ooh, I want to buy that. Like I want to buy that. Like maybe I did have my phase. Like we all have, right? Like, ooh, shiny. And like and you pay tax on that. And it's something you want. So it makes sense that, well, you gotta there's a bit of a price that, there's goods that have to be transported and all that kind of stuff.
hmm So are you
Besides,
so if I can pose a question to you,
yeah.
is your stance that you feel that consumer taxes are justifiable type of thing?
Oh, yeah, yeah, no, 100, especially when we're
Yeah.
in a consumer-based economy,
Yeah.
and I think that if it's done even like we'll get into this later. Like, it's just a thought I've had floating in my head. But I think if there was more structure to consumer based taxes, you wouldn't need as much income taxes on across, like
Yeah.
maybe even across the entire board. But
Okay.
it
So
depends, right?
so
Yeah.
then so in Ontario, right, we pay 13%.
Yeah,
Or is it a
13.5, I
flat
think.
flat? Okay, I
Yeah,
was
it's
gonna say
all
I
it's
don't
all
know.
one
I don't
now.
know if it
Yeah.
went up slightly, but yeah, roughly 13%. It's the harmonized sales tax, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so if would you be willing, like, let's say, um, because okay, consumer taxes are flat rate taxes, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And on top of that, they are taxes that essentially that if I have $1 million and you have $10,000, you and I are getting taxed the exact same,
Same.
right?
Yeah.
Now, would you be willing to have less income tax being taken off? And I know we haven't even really fully tied the conversation around income taxes, but I'm just going to go with where you were already going with things. So let's say we reduce the marginal tax rates on income tax. Would you be open to a consumer tax that is higher than what we currently at?
Oh, on specific goods, especially, sorry, because you mentioned earlier as well, like non-essential stuff, right? Like food's one of those things where it's like everyone's going to need that all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I will say so. This is not I can't speak to every single place in the world, but in Ontario, we do not pay taxes on groceries.
That's correct. You're
We
correct.
pay
Yeah,
taxes
that's
on like if you buy fast food,
yes,
right?
that's different. Are
Like
you go out
because
for
you're
dinner? Yeah,
anything that is like prepared like that, then you pay.
pre-made or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you pay taxes on it, like a restaurant or something like that. But if you go to the grocery store right now, you do not pay taxes on
that's right.
that
Yeah.
food. So there are
Whereas,
certain, like, it's a good point though. There are certain essential goods that it's important that a government honor the fact that you really
yeah,
shouldn't have to pay a tax on kind of a necessity of life, right?
correct. But we did bring
Um,
this up earlier about the tobacco tax,
yeah,
and it could be applied the same thing to alcohol as well, which we already like in Ontario. It's included in the cost. But you would think that something as dangerous as alcohol would it be there'd be a higher deterrent on it if you're like if you're a certain age maybe, or you know what I mean,
okay,
or if you're
yeah,
buying certain types of alcohol, it's like, oh, so you want this much vodka. You know what I mean, or like,
yeah. Like
yeah,
you're talking
because
about quantities rather than types.
well, no, even just like in terms of like getting more taxes in different places and less out of income, like I feel like there's not a like a there is a big of a stigma with alcohol in our society where it's not like that big of a deal, and I think
Yeah,
we kind of just brush aside how dangerous it can be.
100%. Yeah, yeah.
So
No,
that's yeah.
that is definitely
Now I know here it's a bit
true.
different, but
Yeah,
I'm sure in the States they can have Medicare if everybody paid 10 cents on a case of beer. Like it's
yeah,
it's a lot of money going around.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's one of that's
I
just
think
yeah.
it's alcohol. Uh, I was going to say unfortunately, but I don't know what word I want to use with this. But I think alcohol, because it has had, like when we had the era of prohibition, um, because the outcry and like up in arms aspect of
Yes.
regulations with
Yeah.
alcohol,
And
right?
I think the
That
timing of that wasn't good either around the collapse of the economy and everything.
yeah, right?
The Great
Yeah.
Depression, and like
Yeah.
it's also a time where it was like a technologically transitioning time, so it's like you have this whole
Yeah.
like cultural mash, and just the Italians came
Yeah.
over. Hey.
Yeah. So it's yeah, it's all of those things that I think, yeah, a lot of times governments are afraid to touch alcohol. And then
Yeah.
also as a society, we've kind of told ourselves or justified that alcohol, if you're going to do some type of drug, quote unquote, right?
Yeah.
Alcohol is the drug of choice that you should be allowed to have,
To
right? Like
have.
even
Yeah.
though, to your point, it causes just as many problems, if not, right? Like
Yeah.
as anything else, right? But yeah, okay. So like you, it sounds like you're more saying though, for like a consumer tax side of things, that you would focus more on specifics rather
Yeah,
than. Okay, but so
yeah,
does that mean that you wouldn't increase the general tax? Like, so in Ontario, it's 13%, right? Like, whatever. In the States, like, I don't know if you've gone shopping in the States, if you go to
yeah. It
like New
depends on the
York
state, I
versus
think.
Florida type of
Yeah.
situation,
There's a
there's way
very
different
yeah.
consumer taxes, right? I think like Florida is like really, really cheap. New York does like weird things where it's like I think certain times of the year they actually lower their consumer taxes on stuff.
Sir, yeah, I
Um,
gotta ask because my cousins were telling me about that, and it kind of just like,
yeah,
you know what I mean? Because it
yeah,
doesn't like,
yeah,
it doesn't affect
yeah.
me
You're like
normally,
I'm not
right?
there
But
enough. Yeah,
now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like,
yeah,
no, no, no. They were. I remember them complaining about this.
yeah. So everywhere has different like kind of sales tax, right? Um, but so kind of insert. Let's just go because what we know best is Ontario. Um, Focusing on we have a 13% tax right
$100
now. If you
tax.
go
Yeah,
buy whatever, a video game system, a TV, clothing, whatever, you name it, right? Um,
yeah. You're
or
paying.
would you say that you wouldn't touch the general aspect of that?
No, not necessarily. I'm not
You
really
would
great
be
at
open to that going
finances,
higher.
but yeah, and like, well, even again, like specific stuff, especially like because like
Yeah, so
if I
I'm going
got
to
back
say
into
like
Warhammer, like I would be willing to pay a little bit more consumer tax on that stuff because it really is a luxury thing. It's like it's you know what I mean? It's like I get it. I get it.
yeah.
These are plastic soldier
Okay.
toys. It's not a priority in
Yeah,
life.
yes.
Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like toilet paper, paper towel, like for someone like I'm not
You
like
think it's already hit its limit at 13%
yeah,
type
like
of
well,
thing.
I'm not struggling per se, but I see people like that are struggling to like just afford basic stuff.
Yeah, so
So
so let's go back a little bit because it is tough to wrap your mind around this because we're talking a little bit in hypotheticals, and maybe actually before we get really into this kind of consumer tax thing, I think we should go kind of reel it back to our initial point, which was trying to focus on income taxes because I think that
yeah,
that's the starting point, right? So your income taxes at the end of the day, that is the money that you have earned from your job, right?
yeah.
So the ability to even go spend money in the economy, right? Like buy toilet paper,
That's where
buy
it comes from.
Warhammer,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You've had to earn that money somehow, some way, right?
Yeah.
And for the vast majority of people, that comes in the form of income, right? I don't want to
Mhm.
get too much into the different variations of how
Yeah.
people
Let's
get their
just
income sources in the sense of like,
keep it simple. One
yeah,
income, one check,
right?
one job.
Yeah. So if you're a business owner, there are some differences of certain things, but nevertheless, for the vast majority of us, whether you're a CEO of a company or you're a Walmart greeter, you're getting a paycheck, right? Um, and so that paycheck is your income, and that is what gets taxed every year, right?
Yeah.
So we already kind of started this conversation a little bit around this idea of should we pay more in taxes? Should we pay less in taxes? Is income tax right? Like you were talking about how income taxes started in the first place more as like a war measure, right?
Yeah.
Like as an emergency thing, rather than this staple that every single year you're filing your taxes.
Out of like
Because
necessity or whatnot.
yeah,
Yeah.
because you either owe the government money or maybe you overpaid and they owe you a little bit of money, but nevertheless, you have to kind of square up with the government, right?
Yeah.
And like in Ontario, we obviously, from an income tax standpoint, we don't have like the worst income taxes, I would say. They're actually like relatively light. But Canada, like at our federal level, we have pretty high income taxes,
Yeah.
right? Um, it's not very difficult to be in the 30 plus.
Yeah. In Ontario,
but
we get away with it because we're a small country in general, but we have the
yeah,
majority of the people here, so we can get away with it
yes,
a little bit
yeah.
easier.
Not only that, but there is a lot of high earning economy things that exist
Yes.
in
Yeah.
Ontario. So there are other ways to subsidize the system
Yeah.
rather than just from uh,
Income tax.
your income tax. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Um, so yeah, like, so kind of going off of that, right? In your opinion, would you be leaning? Well, actually, here, let's just talk about this because you've talked to me about this before, right? Uh, you're not necessarily someone who is rolling in the dough, right? Like you
No.
make a
Yeah, well,
like you're not
before
poor,
inflation, I was like
but
almost out of. Yeah, I was almost in
yeah,
middle class before inflation kicked back in. I was like, oh, I
yeah,
should have
yeah,
stayed at my last job. It would have made a difference.
yeah. Yeah, but you're not obviously poor because that
No,
especially
I'm
the more
just
that you learn about of people's finances, you're like, oh my gosh, there are people that are really poor, right?
no. Yeah,
um,
it's
but yeah, so you're far from that, but
no. I
you're
just had a slow
also
start to work. That's all it really was.
yeah, right.
I just had
You're
to
also
have to catch up. Yeah.
yeah, definitely, but you're also someone who has to penny pinch, right?
Yes.
Like for a lot of things, right? You have to really be conscious about like, can I afford
Groceries
to buy this?
where I'm
Yeah.
driving to.
Yeah, right. You don't just simply wake up and just do things. You make decisions based off of the
Yeah.
financial impact of that, right? Um so you've talked to me before about this idea that like you hate that you have to pay income taxes, right? Because of the fact that you're already not making that much. Even if they didn't tax you at all, it's still not like you're like, oh my goodness, I'm making so much money, right? Like,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's that idea that um, it kind of sucks a little bit more that you have to pay income
Yeah, and I
taxes,
think it
right?
comes back to you mentioned this kind of passingly earlier is
Mm-hmm.
how we see that money get used, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. So I'm like again, like I obviously like I don't get to choose. It just is what it is, right? So like it's fine.
Yes.
Like but at the end of the day it's like, well, okay, if I'm paying into this, shouldn't the services because if I'm paying this much into it, that
Mm-hmm.
means everybody's paying this much into it.
Yes. Yeah.
So, when I hear stuff like, oh, there wasn't enough hospital beds, and I'm thinking, and how much billions of dollars are taxed from people every year to go? Where did that money get spent then? Spended.
Yeah. Especially it's like how many people live here.
Exactly. You know the population, you take a
Yeah.
census every 5 years.
Yeah.
So I just,
Obvious something like the vid because
yeah. Now,
I don't want to
besides
be
that, even
canceled for
like,
that, but
there's so many
like
examples of
a
like
pandemic, but
the amount of
besides that,
elementary schools that are using textbooks from 30 years ago. And you're like, guys,
yeah,
like if I'm paying this, then like make sure that the stuff's provided for people.
yeah,
Now I'm not saying that we don't have anything provided. Like we're still pretty lucky considering where we live. Like we
yeah. I
can,
think especially living in Canada, living in Ontario, we are very much so a
yeah, but it
socially responsible
correct, but
country
it
where
is
we take care of. But
extremely expensive to live here.
yeah,
Because
yeah,
of that, right? And it's which is fine. Like you and I said, it's like I'm penny pinching, but I'm not like, oh, I gotta have like a piece of toast and a leaf of lettuce today, or like I'm not worried about going hungry. I'm more worried about my diet, I guess. It's the quality of the stuff I'm buying,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's
yeah. You're not going hungry, but you're
yeah,
not
no,
like
not going hungry. It's just you get
yeah,
wondering. You're like, well, I've been eating ramen noodles for like a month or two now.
yeah.
You don't think about it when you're 60. When you're in your 30s, you're like, I wonder if that's gonna
Even that sounds more extreme than you actually are.
yeah, which yeah, I know.
you don't eat ramen for like
I like
days
having ramen
straight. Yeah.
noodles.
Yeah. That,
That one I
that's a
haven't grown out
choice.
of.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think I ever will grow out of that one.
Yeah.
Same
Yeah.
thing with the chicken fingers. There's
Now,
just some things.
slightly different story when we lived together in university. There were times where I definitely lived on the ramen diet.
Oh yeah,
um,
and when you're in school, yeah,
yeah. But yeah, like so I guess okay, so from my standpoint of things, um I'm someone who believes in this idea that we all kind of support the collective, right? We all kind of chip in. Uh, it's almost like the idea of like a potluck
Yeah.
dinner. It's not like every single person is going to bring the same amount of food or spent the same amount, right? Like someone's going to bring buns, others are going to bring a whole casserole, right? There's
Yeah.
going to be some differences, but I'm a firm believer that hopefully everyone is able to truly pay their own share, or like what they can reasonably afford, right? And that's where the
Yeah.
conversation kind of comes into play. So I think both of us would be in agreement that we are not necessarily the type of people that say you should pay no income tax. Am I correct in saying that for you? You can
Yeah, I think
you
for
can
most people, I feel like there is a certain
no,
like
I mean
level
even just
of.
for yourself, like
Yeah, I could pay a certain amount of income tax. I wouldn't have a
yeah,
problem with it.
yeah. So again, we're not talking just yet about like the amount. We're just
No, yeah, yeah.
talking, yeah, because there are people that would say I should have 100% of my money, and then I will choose how I want to spend it.
See, I'm
Right?
not okay. I get that, but you know where I think the line where it should be drawn is overtime, right? Because we're all like required to work a certain amount
Yeah.
of hours,
Yeah.
and I feel like maybe like I think I might be wrong because I can't remember. It's been a while because I've been on salary now, but I think
Yep.
like I think I can't remember. I could be totally wrong about this. First 4 hours aren't taxable, and then after that it is. Or I feel like it should be the other way around. It's like, no, you can tax you up to like 45 hours, but if I decide to work more for myself after that, I'm doing that
So
for
are you saying
me.
that you think that it's like the first 4 hours of overtime aren't taxed?
Yeah, I could be told. I don't know. But like, I remember there's something to do with
I
44 and
yeah.
then after 44 hours. You see
Okay.
what I'm saying? And they actually
Yeah.
tax you more once you do more than 44 hours. But my thinking is, I'm the one putting in that time. I feel like the tax
Oh,
rate should
I
either
actually
stay the
don't know
same. Yeah.
anything necessarily about that. I
Yeah, because
know
the
a
more
lot
overtime
about
you work, the
taxes,
more they
but I don't
tax, and it's kind of
necessarily.
funny because it's like, well, you're like CR, whatever. The CRA is not down here digging in the ditch with me. So,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Do you actually get taxed more for overtime? That's interesting. I didn't
I
know
gotta
that.
double check. I'm pretty sure, yeah, because I
I thought it
remember
was
even
that
at
you
like
lose like quantity
when I was
more, but
working
that's
in
because it's like
restaurants.
you're being paid more, right? If you're getting time and a half, but you're getting still taxed at 30%, let's say,
Yeah,
well, obviously 30% of time and a half is a lot more money than just if you got your normal
regular. Yeah,
salary, right?
no, yeah, it was
So yeah,
something
I didn't
weird.
know
I gotta
that.
look it up
If
again.
that's that
Yeah,
if that is the case.
I'll double check with Paul too, because yeah, I was
I don't think I've ever had a job that like allowed me to get paid for overtime. Like the most I ever
mm,
had were like summer jobs where
see, it's been
if
like
I worked
6
on
years almost.
holidays,
Yeah,
but that wasn't considered like time and a half.
time and
Like
a
sorry,
half.
it wasn't considered overtime. It was considered just like time and a half because it was a holiday time, right?
So yeah, just like it's blurry, but I do
But the rest of
remember at
it's all been
restaurants
salaried.
like why did I put in 95 hours in the last 2 weeks? Like you guys took all
Yeah.
my money.
Yeah. Yeah, but so I guess that is like an interesting thing to think about, right? This
Yeah.
idea that when you are going above and beyond what your job typically requires, right? And your employer is also recognizing that where you're getting paid overtime. Um, should that be taxed the same way as your normal income? Now, it's tough because the argument always comes back to is um, yes, that was your choice to kind of work those overtime shifts.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, that's additional income that you are bringing in,
Well,
right?
and
So,
if I guess maybe not everybody like if I work overtime my job it doesn't like benefit like most of the major institutions that support society really.
yeah,
Like I guess
it's
maybe
more
we could say
just
it's
your
like hey I got
business.
the
Yeah.
sweeper running at the hospital like hey like you know what
Yeah.
I mean, but like there's like there's like just say like it's a construction worker, it's like okay well like that road wasn't scheduled to be done until like a month from now but these guys busted their nuts and got it done, and now they're free
Yeah.
to go do more projects around infrastructure projects around the city. So like you know what I mean, it's like yeah that's you like you said it is a personal choice.
Yeah, so it gets hard because it is at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the rationale for um, why you chose to work it or the impact on society.
The fact is, you did.
You did, but it's also the fact that that is now more income that you have in your pocket. So I definitely like again, I can't speak to that idea of
Yes,
if
I
you
can't
get
remember
taxed greater on overtime. I've never actually heard of that.
after like
Um,
yeah,
if that was the case, I think that would be horrible, right? So I'm just gonna throw that out there. But I do have a hard like as much as I agree with you in some ways where when you're working overtime that it hurts. It's like almost feels like, oh my gosh, I had to work more hours than I should have, and then now I'm also paying more like taxes on top of that. Like it felt like no benefit. It was just more that like my employer squeezed more out of me, right?
out of you, yeah,
Um, but then it is like so. There's always that gray area of like if you were forced to work overtime, right, when you didn't want to, then it feels like a double whammy of I'm now forced to be here on the weekend or something like that. And
yeah,
then I
yeah,
also am getting taxed by the government. But then I
yeah.
also could see the flip side. Sorry, what were you saying?
No, no, no.
Or
I just flashbacks to
disagree?
working
Yeah.
in restaurants.
Flash
Yeah,
the
yeah,
PTSD. Yeah.
yeah. It's of all the time you don't ask for that overtime hours. Sometimes people
Yeah.
just don't show up.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. So, but I do also see it as at the end of the day, you walked home, taxes or not, with more money in your pocket after that week than you would on a typical week because you worked more, right?
Yeah,
The issue always comes into play is that there are like some jobs just naturally pay more than others. So I could work 35 hours a week, you could work 40 hours a week,
yeah,
and we could come home with the same amount of money, right?
yeah.
Because
Oh
we
yeah,
work different jobs, right?
yeah,
Um, but at the end of the day, if you didn't work those extra 5 hours, you would be taking home less money, right?
yeah,
So it is kind of hard, right? Because if you're going to have income taxes in the first place, I do understand why you would tax, like, continue to tax any source of income that you're kind of bringing home right at the end of the day.
yeah. I still
Um,
like. Yeah, I agree to disagree on that one because
well, because I think you're feeling the burn of it, right? But I
well,
don't
to a
know.
degree, yeah. But like, like again, there's so many different jobs out there, right? Like, it's just
So here's a like I'll again, you don't have to agree with me, but I'm going to try to persuade you here. Let's say you don't work overtime, but
yeah,
instead you work a second job,
yeah. Been there.
right? So are
Yeah.
you from that same logic, would you say at that second job you shouldn't get taxed?
Well, I feel like I shouldn't get taxed more for having another job.
But it's not that you get taxed more, right? Like it's just based off of the marginal tax rate, right? So the way that it works, if I worked one job, let's say I made $50,000 at
The
that one job.
government sees your gross salary though. So if they see me making 40K here before taxes and 15K here before taxes, they see me making 55K,
Yes.
which isn't really fair because the 15K I'm making at that job cost me more time out of my life, and it really
But
is
that
only
but
helping
that
me cover like expenses, right? Like most people are
yeah,
working two
and
jobs because they can't make ends meet.
so what do you say to someone who says you should just get a better job in the first place then? It's your fault, so to speak, that
Mm.
you have a job that pays you $40,000 rather than one job that pays
Well,
you
that's the thing. Like somebody has to
sixty
do it,
thousand
right?
dollars, right? Yeah, yeah. But
So,
but but the argument would be, right, like especially in our system, right?
no, yeah,
Um, because we live in a system where you earn an income based off of the job that you do.
yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I am an extreme advocate for the idea of everyone
Well, that's what I
should be
mean by there's
making
so
money.
many different variables. Like, I know people working two jobs that are making a ton of money. You know what I mean? And it's like they don't
and
even
that's what
really
I guess
need the
maybe
second
that
job, right? Like,
well, so
and
that
that's
then that's the other thing, right? Like, so let's
yeah,
flip it, right? You gave the scenario of like maybe you're working two jobs so that you can afford life. What if
Yeah.
I choose to work 2 jobs? So like my wife is one of those people, works multiple jobs, but that's so that we like not so that we can survive, just so that we can
Have
choose to
more.
have a
Yeah.
certain lifestyle, right?
Yeah.
That we have more disposable income. By that same logic, would you say that the person who is just choosing to work harder in life to get more and more ahead, that they should pay the taxes because they didn't need that money, so to speak, right? Versus
Yeah.
someone who,
Yeah, because it's like a matter of rags, like not even rags and riches, but like it's like personal choice again. Like if you're like it's the government sees everyone's taxes. They know exactly what you're paying, what your cost
yep,
of living is, right? So
yeah,
they know if this
yeah,
person's paying $2,800 a month in mortgage and makes $62,000 a year, they're not eating as healthy as the person that's making 95K a year and is mortgage free,
yeah.
right?
I
So
cannot. There is no part of me at all that agrees with you with that statement because of the fact. So okay, I, I'm not going to talk about what I believe from an idealist world, right? Like an
yeah, yeah,
idyllic
yeah.
world. You know, I that is my yeah, my soapbox that I stand on. What I'm more talking about is if we are trying to look at this from a current world reality, right? So not what you know, what I've talked to you about in terms of the idyllic utopian type of society.
Yeah.
Um, I can't look at someone who works multiple jobs and increases their sources of income, whether they are poor or rich, and judge them differently. Now, I can make the argument with you that, and I've said this to you before, maybe. So, the way that our tax system works, obviously, hopefully, people have an idea of this. I don't know if we fully talk about this. Oh no, we do talk about it. This in the previous episode.
Previous.
So,
Yeah.
in the case of income taxes, right? We have a system, just brief synopsis, right? We have a system called like a marginal tax system, and that what that means is that you have your source of income. So if you, let's say, make $100,000, right? It's not that your entire salary of $100,000 is taxed at a single flat rate.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
that it's broken down into different like kind of brackets of income,
Yeah.
right? So in Ontario, I think it's like whatever the first like $10,000 or something like that is not taxed at all, right?
Yeah.
And then it's like the next
$5,000 or
whatever
something. Yeah.
$15,000 is taxed at X amount, right?
Yeah.
And then so on and so forth, and it kind of goes up from there, right? So I would agree, if you would agree with this, I guess, because you didn't necessarily say this as a point, but I would say that it is fair to have a system where maybe instead of that $10,000 being the like tax free, instead you have a
The
system
first.
where yeah, maybe it's the first $30,000, right? It means that everyone who is working, who at
Which
least
we
is
would
making
consider like the
$30,000,
poverty line here.
is
Yeah.
getting that money, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like so there is like so. Yeah, I was going to say there's two kind of ways that I would look at it, and one I do think is a little bit better than the other. You could have it where it's a flat system where everyone, if they make obviously this much money, their first $30,000 is tax free, right?
Yeah.
So both you and I obviously make more than $30,000. Our first $30,000, no taxes on it, right?
Yeah.
So that's one
After.
system that would
Yeah.
mean that at least at the end of the day, you're
Everybody
taking
gets
home
a base amount
$30,000 to survive
to
in
live
life.
with. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're still making money above that,
Above
but it's
that. Yeah.
taxed,
But
right?
that's taxed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Obviously there is some stipulations with that I could go down a rabbit hole of. The issues will come into play of like if you compare a system where you're currently where we're at now versus a system that you don't get taxed at the first $30,000, but then above that the tax rates are way higher, right?
Yeah,
There
incrementally or
is a give
whatever.
and
Yeah.
take, right? Like there, you may actually take home more money in a system that only gave you $10,000. That was like kind of free income, so to speak,
Yeah.
or not tax. I shouldn't even say free because it is your income. Um, so there's that kind of things. Probably the better solution, again, adjusting for what those potential other tax rates are going to be.
Yeah.
Um, but let's even just say hypothetically that the tax rates stay the same as what we have now. And this maybe I think would be more along the lines of what you would like hope for yourself. That what you do is that you have a system where maybe it's not quite $30,000. Maybe it's the first $20,000 or
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
$25,000, right? We can look at the numbers to kind of see what a basic standard of living we would want, right?
Yeah.
Based off of um, someone who, like you said, someone has to work those jobs. Um, but you would have a situation where you only get that $25,000, whatever, tax free, if at the end of the day you only took home, or sorry, not take home, you only earned, right,
Yeah.
before taxes, like pre-tax, uh let's say, I don't know, $50,000 or something like that,
Something like
right?
that.
Like,
Yeah.
right. So if you're someone who makes under a certain threshold, you're eligible for a larger sum of tax-free income,
Income.
right?
Yeah.
So that I think kind of gets to where you're talking about this idea of like, obviously for yourself, if you work two jobs, you needed that money a lot more than, let's say, when I work two jobs, I don't need that money, right?
Yeah.
In comparison, right?
Relatively
Because
speaking. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, because like, sure, we both get by, but I maybe get by a lot better, so to speak, than what you might, right? Just based off of what our salaries are.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's obviously people that make even way less money, and so those people, maybe those are the ones where you're like, okay, at least that $30,000 or whatever, that $20,000, if
Yeah.
you're going to take home that at least is going to help with your rent, it's going to help for your food, it's going to help for your whatever, right?
Yeah.
But it's
Whatever. Yeah.
still honoring the
Utilities.
fact that in society, you I I I'm going to say this, but I kind of only agree to it to a certain point. But
Yeah.
essentially, you work the jobs that you work, right? At the end of the day, if you're a server at a restaurant, if that's what you are doing with your life, then that's what you've chosen to do with your life, and kind
Yeah.
of the positives and negatives, consequence wise, kind of come with that,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
So if you're only going to make so much money, then you're only going to make so much money.
Which might,
So
yeah.
it's not to kind of say that if you're someone who's choosing to better themselves and make more money, that I'm going to punish you more necessarily than
Yeah.
someone who is struggling, right?
Just to keep their head above water or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's all like kind of, you're trying to keep things as relative in the scope, right? And so
Yeah.
it might mean that, um, let's say for yourself, you might not be eligible for that flat rate of $20,000, but someone who's making $20,000 less than you is eligible for that
Eligible for
flat
it. Yeah.
rate with that extra 10 grand or whatever that they're going to get tax free,
Yeah.
right? I do think a system like that has its merits. And you can make the argument that
No. Yeah.
in some ways we kind of have that in the different ways that you can have tax deductions, right?
Yeah.
Um, there
Yeah. And
are
lose.
certain things that people who make less income can be eligible for, but then you also have the flip side, is there are things that are within the tax codes that people with more money are eligible for, people with like, right, like across the board,
Yeah.
there's always things that you can have deductions wise, right?
Yeah.
If you have a child, there's deductions.
Sections. Yeah.
If you have a business, there's ways to have deductions. If you
Electric
have a
vehicle.
kid in
Yeah.
university, right?
Yeah.
Like there's always
Or a
something, right?
hybrid. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. And arguably speaking, people with less income have less tools at their disposal for reducing their income. So,
Yeah.
not to get crazy into it, but obviously, you and I both know we have registered savings accounts like an RRSP,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
which
Usually
that type of account, if you put money into it to invest, right? um, the money that you've put into it reduces your taxable
tax.
income, right?
Yeah.
But if you're kind of scraping by, right? If you only have X amount of dollars in the first place and you don't even can't even afford life, there's no money for you to put into an RSP, right?
RSP.
Like for
Yeah.
your retirement, right? Or to reduce your taxable income because you don't even have that money in the first place
First
to
place. Yeah.
like as discretionary spending, right? Um, so yeah, I think for myself, as much as I do hear you out on the aspect of when you're someone who's struggling and you're having to work two jobs, um, I I'm the first person to say like that is super unfair. Like I don't think that if you're working 40,000, if you're working 40 hours a week, making only $40,000, right? And you're trying to support a family or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah.
um,
It's
I think it's horrible that you have to be in a situation where I now have to work 72 hours a week and I never see my family and whatever, right? Like that kind of stuff.
yeah. And then
Um,
again, too, like you were saying, there's so many factors, right? Like in terms of like, oh, maybe you weren't ready to have a kid yet, now you got one, right?
100%,
Like,
right?
yeah. So
Yeah.
you never know, but like, yeah, there's so many.
Yeah. So yeah, there's like the moral standpoint. I don't know, right? Like the emotional side of it, and then there's the like, well, like the cut and dry, like this is the job that you're choosing to work, right? And this is what the market is paying for it.
That's
Um,
yeah.
right. Like so there's that side of things. But then at the same time, um, from a tax standpoint, right? Removing this idea of I think it's wrong that people have to work multiple jobs just to survive in life. Um, from a tax standpoint, I can't justify like being harder on someone who
Yeah.
maybe
Well, not
doesn't
the
need
way
the
the
money because
system is set up right now, anyways, especially, right? Where
yeah, like and that's
it's
and
kind of
that's what it
just
is,
like
right?
a
Like I think that
blanket.
there's yeah, if you're going to stick with our general aspect of our current system, right? Market capitalism type of thing.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think you should punish someone who is working super
No,
hard.
because that's the rules, right? Like you're allowed to reap what you sow.
But even just rules or not, right? Like if
Yeah.
like obviously this is from personal, but like I have lived like a life where like both myself and my wife work multiple jobs not because we have to, but because it allows us to have more
Yeah.
money to do other things, right?
Yeah.
We work hard. We work at like evenings, weekends, right? Like that's time that we are taking out of our own lives to be
Yeah,
able to
exactly.
earn more income, right? So it doesn't matter that the fact that our current like kind of career jobs, right, pay for a lot of things already because we make a decent living. I'm not saying it's like
Yeah.
anything insane, but we obviously make more money than the vast majority of people, I guess, if you looked at it statistically. Um, right? Like so I wouldn't look at it like to like kind of say that that person should be set to a different standard than another person. But in some ways we kind of are because when I earn more income, because I'm at a higher tax bracket, I'm also every dollar that I earn extra is taxed at greater than someone who is maybe only making $50,000. If they make an extra $10,000, they're not losing as much of that $10,000 in comparison to what I'd be losing, right?
Mhm.
Because I'm at a lot higher of a tax bracket, right? So indirectly, I think that that is maybe justified where I lose a little bit more of the higher tax bracket I go, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I wouldn't say that it's like, okay, those people, like how you were saying before, right? If it's the overtime or if it's you're choosing to work two jobs, that that second job or that overtime should be untaxed 100%. versus the person who,
No, but I feel like there should be adjustments, right? Like
and I think that that's where
in a
I would
perfect
go.
world, yeah,
Yeah. And that's where I go more. Yeah, because I don't want us to go too far down the rabbit hole of like a perfect world. I would
yeah,
try to like keep with how do we make this system, right? If we were if we were still trying to live generally speaking like this, right? And I think that that really comes back down to this idea of how can I find other ways to
to
make sure that you can afford life, right? If
yeah,
you're someone
exactly,
who does the basic jobs of our world, right? And therefore are making the basic incomes of our world, how do I make sure that you're not struggling more than like society thinks you should, right? That
yeah,
I think is the kind of,
bottom,
yeah, the bottom line of it,
sorry,
right?
common denominator, yeah,
Yeah. No, I totally. So I think that's where my head gravitates more towards, rather than okay, punish someone who makes a lot. But like the other aspect of things is like you could make the argument of like taxing the rich, right?
yeah,
Um, let for argument's sake, because the reality is taxing the rich for the most part doesn't really work. But I can explain that afterwards. But let's focus on someone who is like a CEO of a company, or vice president or president of a company, and they're making tons of money, right? You hear all the time, whatever, like the people on the sunshine list, right?
yeah,
Making multiple six figure salaries, right?
yeah,
um, Directors of school boards or heads of I don't know, right? Like
yeah,
like the
unions
police
or
commissioner.
whatever,
I don't know,
yeah,
right? Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
usually it's a union
All
or
the different
something,
things.
yeah,
Those are all public service jobs, but even just like not like private stuff as well.
oh yeah,
Um, where you're making an income though, right? We're focusing on that side of things. Arguably speaking, taxing those people more um would mean that there is more money to go to the
distribute
bottom
around
half,
again
right?
or whatever,
Yeah.
yeah,
But then you, of course, run into the issues of how much is too much, right?
hmm
So, like, actually, do I have? I can't remember off the top of my head. So, let me see something here. If I have it mentally on me. Um, okay, so just for like, because I had mentioned this in the previous episode, right? So in Canada, our federal income tax brackets are um, like, let's say if you're on the top tax bracket, so everything over $214,000
yeah,
and yeah, $214,368 is taxed at 33%, right?
yeah,
So if you made whatever, literally even a dollar more,
more,
that
yeah,
dollar is going to be, you're going to get 33 cents taken off of that,
taxed off of
right?
it, yeah,
Yeah. So for every dollar, you're making 67 cents, right?
yeah,
Um, the question comes to play is that, right? Like the conversation of, is 33% high enough? Is it too high? Is it right? Like, so I think for a lot of people, they would say, well, if you're already making every single year $215,000, that feels like a lot of money, right? So
yeah.
even losing 33% on every single dollar, it's like, oh, well, that feels like if you're not making that kind of money, you feel justified in being like, well, you're losing 33 cents on the dollar, but like you also have way more
It
discretionary
doesn't make a
income than anyone
dent.
else.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
But then you have the flip side of, if you are someone who's making that money, let's say right? Like we always try to look at the arguments of someone who's working really hard but not making a lot of money. There
Mm.
are also people that genuinely do work really, really hard for their
Yeah, make a
jobs
ton of money. Yeah.
that make a ton of money, right? Obviously, there's your, not that we're going to go into it, right? Like a whatever TikTok star who
Yeah,
makes
no,
a
no.
couple
We're talking
dances.
like, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And you're like, what did you really do to earn that those
I'm trying
hundreds
to
of
like
thousands of dollars?
conventional ideas of like entrepreneurism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So, but if you have the, like you said, that conventional versions of it, it's hard to say to that person that worked really hard that they, one, should have to pay the, like, lose a third, right? Because that's what it is. 33% is a third of their salary on those extra dollars, right?
Yeah.
Or even ask, like, the idea of taxing rich people even further, right? Like there's some
Yeah.
people that would say we should go to 50%, right? Like after a certain point, right?
Point. Yeah.
Um, like, so whatever, let's say we add another tax bracket and say everything from, I don't know,
350.
300, yeah, just we'll keep it easy, 300,000, everything above that you're taxed at 50 cent, like 50 cents to the dollar, 50%, right? But then that's the idea of like, so every hour that you worked, like, or whatever, right? Like the every dollar that you earned extra,
Earned. Yeah.
it was like you had to do double the time to earn it almost, right?
Yeah.
Because you lost 50% of it,
Percent. Yeah.
right? And so it is a very difficult situation, right? Because as much as I think you and I don't necessarily have, we're not holding any pity parties for rich people,
No.
but
Well, and
at
that's
the
the
same
old saying. It's
time,
like the difference between like people don't realize the difference between a million and a billion.
yes,
Like
yeah.
like a million seconds
Sorry, that was a really
will
long, but yeah.
happen in like 24 hours, but a billion seconds, like I just hit a billion seconds of existence on this planet like a month ago. It's 32 years.
Yeah,
so,
yeah,
so like yeah, but I hit a million seconds probably back when I was like a kid. Like,
yeah. No, I think it's even crazy like that. I think it's like
yeah,
a
I'm not.
million is like within a week, and then like,
Yeah, something like that, and then
yeah,
like a
yeah,
billion's like 25 years or something. You're like,
yeah,
oh my
so something
god.
crazy like that. Because I have heard that before. I think it was
Yeah, yeah. I can't. It was
someone.
somewhere recently, but yeah, like to your point, it gets sticky that way, right? Like, where do you draw the line, right? Like, like if you're
Yeah,
going to be
right.
taxed this much, like how much are you making? But like that's
Yeah,
where I kind of like in an ideal world, like I mean, they're collecting everybody's information and scrutinizing it. So if they're going through that much effort in the first place, you know,
yeah. So I think what we're kind of getting at, right, is that we wouldn't say that we want an equality based system. We want an
correct.
equity
Yeah,
based system,
equity based system. Yes,
right? So it's not that, like,
100%.
so
Yeah,
the whatever the
equality
base
is
tax rate is zero
yeah.
to $48,000 in Canada, right? So if you make $0 or if you make up to $48,535,
Whatever. Yeah.
you pay 15%, right?
Yeah.
But you're saying that, like, so you and I obviously make more than that amount of money, so we would be paying 15% on that sum of money, right?
Yeah.
But you're saying that if you're someone who maybe only makes $48,000 in the first place, rather than we make thousands upon thousands of dollars more than that,
Hmm.
that maybe that person who only made that $48,000 shouldn't have to pay 15% on that whole amount. It's maybe that they instead have like a different tax bracket that works for them,
For
that
them. Yeah.
maybe they're paying the 15% only on $18,000, right?
Dollars.
Like,
Yeah.
so the thirty thousand
And then
dollars is
after
not
that, it's like
paid
12% or something. Yeah. Like, yeah.
yeah. Or even just the idea of like it it then after that point, like, it it's almost irrelevant, because
Yeah.
if you're only
It
eligible
doesn't
for it because you didn't make enough money.
up to that
If you
point.
start
Yeah.
making, if you somehow move your 48,000 to
Then,
60,000, then you're like everyone else and you pay the, like,
yeah.
whatever the normal tax rates that are going on, right?
Yeah.
Um and so on and so forth, right? So it's really looking at the poorest people in society and saying, how can we um, allow you to have more money? And I
Yeah.
guess what that really comes back down to, and or maybe kind of maybe switching slightly with gears here, um, is looking at why are we even saying that it would be better for people to have more money in the first place, right? Because the argument could be that it doesn't actually matter how much I tax you as long as I support you at the end of the day, right? So if I'm the government and you make, let's say, $40,000, even if you're losing 15% on that, it shouldn't really matter if at the end of the day you technically actually receive that full 15% and maybe then some back
Mhm.
in government supports, right?
Correct. Now that's going back to like
Yeah.
that's not the way the world works. Unfortunately, it would be nice if it did.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was like yeah, there's a bit of
Well,
shortcomings in
I
terms of
think it
how the
is hard,
money's
right? Because
allocated. Yeah.
there are some people that are maybe on the poorest levels of society that probably actually do get pretty close to what they chipped in, they get back and then some, right? The
Mhm.
issue is that they're that poor in the first place, right? It's that we haven't said that like a standard of living is this. So
Yeah.
therefore, right? Like I think a case in point, right? There are people, like we live in a welfare state, so to speak, right? Like so there are people who do not work at all
Hmm.
that make a basic
Income.
uh,
Yeah.
income. Yeah, thank you. Right, and it's not because necessarily they're whatever someone with special needs that can't like their
Work.
exceptionalities don't allow them
Yeah.
to do that. It's someone that for whatever other reasons,
Can't.
right?
Yeah.
Maybe like
Mental
uh,
issues. Yeah.
yeah,
Sometimes
certain
it's the
things that are not
case.
like your typical like yeah, like I don't know, maybe you got in trouble with the law and now you can't get a
Yeah.
job,
Yeah.
right? um Whatever it may be, right? Like so there are people that are on welfare, um that those people technically like not, I know this sounds like obviously harsh, but they put nothing into the system. So
Yeah.
and then there are other people that put, maybe they make $20,000 and they put a little bit into the system, but then they're also eligible for all of these other government assistant things,
Bonuses
right?
and yeah. Yeah.
Like just recently, the federal government added, um, like what were the healthcare thing? Like I think it's like dental and eye stuff
Yeah. Something like that.
for people who make have a household income of less than whatever. Oh, actually no. Sorry. It's specifically for children though, if I
Yeah.
remember
That's right.
correctly,
Yeah. I
right?
think it's yeah.
But nevertheless, right? Because that's the other thing with taxes that we didn't, I don't think this time around we really chatted about this, but the other issue with taxes as a whole, and not really taxes as a whole, but just government support as a whole, is that it affects everyone differently because we don't all access the system the same way, right? You and
Yeah.
I are not necessarily accessing hospitals. You don't have a child. I do. Like I
Yeah.
don't have a child in school, but you don't have a child right now. So you're not going to be accessing the school systems. I
Correct. Yeah.
not technically yet either, but but eventually my daughter will access the school system, right?
Yeah.
Um we all use the roads and you're like, okay, that's one that you can be like everyone utilizes it, right? But
Water
you and
treatment, all
I
that kind of
don't use
stuff.
public transit. We're lucky enough we have our
Correct.
own
Yeah.
vehicles,
Yeah.
but our public transits are built around tax dollars, right? So
Yeah.
that does get into a very, I don't know if like confusing is even the right word, but like an interesting situation to how you should look at governments paying for, like our government's doing a good job, right? I think the basic answer would be and should be no. But to say
Yeah.
that they're not doing things for some people, right? Like I think that that's a harder one to get around, right? Because there are people that are benefiting from the social assistance of things. Because and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because that leads back to that argument of why some people feel that you should just really privatize everything. Like, I will tax you less, and then you
Put
can take your money and go into the private system and take care of yourself, right? Like,
yeah,
that's really in the United States, that's that mentality around like kind of Medicare, right? Um, is this idea that you go to the hospital, you pay your what you want, or like what you need, and then you go on your own way. I'm going to tax you less. You have to pay your own medical bills, right?
yeah,
Um, in comparison, or like education could be the same way, right? I'm not going to fund schools. Instead, there will be all these schools that exist. You pay a fee to attend those schools, and based off of what you can afford, you go to such and such school, right? Um, and that's where I think it is tough to fully answer that question, even though I think the things that they're doing right, they are great, but it's, I think both of us would say that there's a lot of misspending of things where it's just
yes,
like, why did you put money into that? Like,
yeah.
who thought that that
Which
was a good
that's
idea?
probably the most obvious part for most
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. Right. Who signed off on this? Right. Um, where it's
That
like the
stupid rubber duck.
short-sightedness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. So, and that, I think that that's a difficult conversation around taxes, right?
Mhm.
Should we pay more? Should we pay less? Um, we kind of touched about it right away, and I think that that's where the conversation immediately leads towards, right?
Yeah.
The issue around where people feel that governments are not upholding their end of the bargain when it comes to taxes. So it's easy for me to say we should pay more or we should pay less or whatever, but that almost doesn't, it's almost hard to even have that conversation because the agreement in the first place has been, I don't want to say like voided, but like it hasn't been like upheld, right?
Yeah.
So how can I say we should pay more taxes when we don't spend our taxes
Correctly.
well in the first place?
Yeah.
But also, how should I say should pay less taxes when I know full well that, like, as much as the conservative mindset, the right leaning in terms of taxes, right? Liberal taxes. I know that that's a very confusing term. Not liberals in the sense of politics. Liberals in the sense of economics, um, would say that you should have like free market. You should not have government involved with any of those things.
Yeah.
You should leave money to the people and they can decide what they're going to spend that money on, right? So conservative economics are like, if you have a conservative mindset, right? Like, so the Conservative Party of Canada, or if you're a Republican in the United States, you would believe
It's a
in
little bit
liberal
different between
economics.
the two of them in each country, but yeah.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the, like, if you're right on the spectrum in terms of politics, if you want to even look at it like that, you would have liberal economic policies is what you would believe in. Very confusing that they do it that way, and that's that's how it sounds. But yeah, it is hard because when you have that mindset of that pure freedom, it shouldn't be very hard for people to realize that if you're on anywhere close to the fringe of society of not being able to afford things, you're not going to be able to afford things when you have to do it on your own, right? The
Yeah.
purchasing power that the government is able to do, not only from like the fact that they are able to purchase things on large scale, but the government is able to go on into debt different than you and I or a business can go into debt, right?
Yeah.
The government does not have the same kind of constraints in that way. But it really does come back to this idea of, is the government giving all that they could with the money that they've taken in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think if we're going to have like I know we've been trying to fight the urge of having this conversation, but I know you've brought it up a bit, and I've definitely tried to fight it. But the conversation around what an ideal society is, that's when I think you could say what the hypothetical of, hey, if you had a
Yeah,
government that was providing proper health care, right? There wasn't any issues with uh, beds or the speediness of it, right?
delivery,
Um,
whatever.
the
Yeah,
justice system, right? That you had quality um, justice services or fire and ambulance services, right? That
yeah,
you had roads that were maintained well, that you had schools that had resources to better um, educate
yeah. All the obvious
everyone,
social
right? Like,
services. Yeah,
yeah, if you had all those things, water treatments, right? Like, because obviously there are lots of places, both in Canada and as well as like the United States, that you hear all the time about places that have poor water treatments, right? If those things were all provided,
yeah.
what would your so for me, if you told me that all of these things were going to be taken care of, right? Again, recognizing that I might not be utilizing every single thing uh, in my current state of life.
Yeah.
Um, but if I gave you that hypothetical, that dream world scenario that these things were all provided, would you be fine paying more taxes?
Depends how much, but I don't see like if it's provided, I can negotiate for sure.
Yeah. So let's just say um, they're not going to leave you with nothing, right? Because the
Yeah.
other thing is that you okay, this is going to seem like very confusing in some ways. But if you took your job, your current salary, and objectively looked at it as where it is on the scale of jobs, right? In terms of salary, like how much you earn, right? Not looking at taxes, not looking at like what you take home, just what the employer says this is what you're kind of worth, right? Relative to other jobs, right? Like I don't know what's the most basic job in the world, right? Like um
Nah, whatever. It's not.
I don't know,
Just
like
think of anything.
yeah, yeah. Think of what it may be, right?
Yeah.
That you would have in a relative scale, right? Um, like you would have,
So what are
I
you
don't know.
saying though? Like how much more am I being taxed? Because I'm already being taxed a third of my income now.
And that's
So
what I'm
if
saying
all
though.
of
Like
those
maybe,
services were provided to me and my rent was somehow paid with enough money for me to do what I wanted to do after the fact, then yes.
well, so okay, but that so how can I look at this,
Because that's the
right?
thing, like services only go so far. Like people have ambitions and shit they want to do in their lives, and that's where their personal income comes into play. And I think for most people,
Yeah,
the
but I
majority
guess
of their
I guess
lives,
my
that's
hard
more
part is
important
I
than the
can't.
services.
It's hard for me to phrase this, and the reason I'll explain why. So you and I, we both know I make more money than you at my job, right?
Mhm.
So in theory, I'm able to do more outside of my basic expenses,
Yeah,
right? I have more discretionary income.
yeah,
There are people that make less money than you that have less discretionary income. There is a point that you would have to make the argument of, is this job so far at the bottom of the totem pole that there is no discretionary income? Let's say you make, I don't know, right? Like I'm just
like
going to throw this number out
yeah,
there. Let's say you make $35,000.
yeah,
Let's say 100% of your money is taxed, right? I'm going a little bit
yeah, yeah.
ridiculous with this, but let's just say you lose 100% of it, but your like kind of food, shelter, right? Like go down the like basic necessities of life.
Mm.
You're not worried about like a if you're going to get 3 meals a day, right? You're not worried like for you
I don't know.
and
Just
your
that sounds like
family.
dangerously like totalitarian in a sense of like, oh, we'll just provide everything for you. I don't think people. I don't think that's what drives people. Like people want to go and get stuff for themselves.
So you would say that you're better off in a world where you have a family that has that situation, that they don't necessarily, maybe those kids don't get breakfast, they don't get lunch, they not sure if they get dinner that night, that their, I don't know, their apartment building that they live in is like super run down, like
Mm-hmm.
below a standard that we're like, oh my god, that's like
Yeah,
these the rust is coming through on the pipes like for the water, or right, like go down the like kind of horrible
tell me about
situations
that
of our
one.
world, right?
Yeah.
um which are not really far, right? Like I work in the education system. I can tell you right now, I know that there are families that are in this situation, right?
Oh
The
yeah.
whole reason why a lot of schools have created
I live
um
in a building where there's people like
yeah, yeah,
that.
right, right,
I
like
don't have
so,
to go to work. I just have to walk out my front door. Like,
yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, right, ignoring the drive factor, because I agree with you. I think that you should want to, like, I'm the type of person, if you paid for every single thing for me, I'm still going to choose to work because, like, yes, yeah, right. But there are also going to be people that are like, I'll, if I could just freeload off the system, I'll freeload off the system, right? Right. So you the oh, we lost Jordan. Maybe I'll pause for a second here. Oh, I think he's coming back. There you are. Yeah. All right. Well, no, no. That's fine. Your participation. It says now that you're not recording. So, a
yeah,
little bit of
where are we?
technical difficulties, but we are back. So, I was just in the middle of saying to you, right? If we ignored, and I know that this is sometimes difficult, but ignore the idea that, um, like, there are some people that want to do more for their lives. There are other people that aren't doing as much to benefit themselves, right?
Yeah, besides
If
that.
you just looked at it purely from the standpoint of, you have some people who right now can't afford things in life, right? Are you saying, in your opinion, that you think that they are better off in that situation where they're kind of currently at, rather than what you said, more of like a, you felt like it was a bit of a tyranny or authoritarian type of regime that if you tax them 100%, right? If you had people that made very little income, tax them
Mm-hmm.
100%, but said all of your basic necessities are provided for you, you said to me that that would be kind of like tyranny or whatever word, I forget what you said, but um
I wanted to say, but no.
this is the issues with our technical difficulties, how much time has elapsed between us talking. But
Well,
yeah,
because
like,
we were
so what
talking
are your
about like
thoughts? Yeah.
people that are like, because we are saying like there's the people that like are on welfare, for instance, and like they can't like
Hmm.
work.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
in that case, that I like that makes complete sense to me because like how else can they? You know what I mean? Like
Well, if you're on welfare, you're not making income, right?
income, yeah.
I mean, or you're making super small
But
amounts of
if you're at
income
like the
that it's
lowest
irrelevant.
level of like income that you could possibly make, like consider like the poverty line or whatever,
Okay.
like
Yeah.
that makes sense to me
That
because like
you could say that. So you're saying that, so for someone who makes what you classify as the poverty line, because I'd have to look up what
yeah,
statistically
it
is
kind of that
considered that,
changed.
but
They changed it again.
let's
Yeah,
just say whatever that is, right? Let's say it's, you make $20,000. I don't know. I'm just throwing out a number here, right?
yeah.
If that's considered what the poverty line is, are you kind of clarifying your point in the sense that you would say that it's fine to tax them 100%, but then say, here's everything for you?
Yes.
Okay. Because your
Yeah.
original thing, that was what I was trying to get at,
No, I
right? Because
guess there
your
was a
original point was,
miscommunication there because I was thinking you were like I was looking at it differently, but no, when now I'm listening to the question again now,
yeah. So, like, because I'll, like, obviously for our listeners, it'll, they're probably like, well, you just said this, but it's the idea that, so you and I, on our current incomes, in our current society, do have discretionary income, right?
yes,
Meaning that
yeah,
you have money that is left over after you kind of pay for your
paid
basic
everything.
necessities. If you want to, whatever, buy a video game, you want to go out to get food, you want to buy a present for someone, whatever, right? Like,
Yeah,
like whatever it may be, you have the ability to do that, right? There are people in this world that
that
have jobs
yeah,
that don't allow for any
any of that.
discretionary
Yeah,
income,
it's
right?
all yeah,
And there's some people that don't even don't even have, sorry, not only do they not have discretionary income, but they also don't have the ability to pay for their bare necessities. And what
yeah,
my question would be to you is that, um if you had a government that legitimately took care of your basic needs, would you be fine if you worked a job that would be considered,
like that. Yeah,
that could only pay for your bare necessities of
yeah,
life, or less than, that you actually have 100% of that kind of taken
yeah,
away?
yeah. Because then it gives people opportunity to start pursuing stuff like they're not worried about spending all their time just trying to survive.
Yeah, you don't have to, you're not thinking about
Yeah,
struggling, like if
yeah.
one week you didn't make enough money or something
Yeah,
like
as
that. Is that
long
what you're
as you
saying?
go and do your part, it's covered, right? So that's yeah. No,
Yeah.
I don't think that's a terrible idea at
So
all.
then, so with that
In a
being said,
perfect world, yeah,
let's just say, based off of your salary, I don't know how, what do you think percentage of your salary is like discretionary income? Like 5%, 10%, 20%? What are we talking about?
I guess at the moment, like yeah, like 10 to 15 range,
Okay,
and
so
but
then
that
let's
that'll
say,
change in time too, right? So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. I'm, again, it
yeah,
doesn't really matter what the number is. I
yeah.
just needed you to
I'm
give
just
give me a
spitballing
number.
off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So let's just say 15% is what.
yeah,
So if I said to you that, um, like 85% of your salary was taxed, but you had a government that provided for all of society, like whatever they needed, right? You would say that you would be okay with a system like that,
yeah. I mean,
because
if
it
I
would
was
take
happy
that
with the
away
fifteen
from.
percent, yeah,
Well, so this
like
is the big
yeah,
thing, right? You don't have a choice necessarily. Okay, that's maybe a weird way to phrase it. Based off of the current system, right? Your job is deemed that it's X amount valuable, right?
yeah,
And so, kind of the equation of of work is that, like, obviously things like inflation and whatever, like, affect things, but you are paid, like, so we pay a fry cook at McDonald's a certain wage because we deem that that job is only worth so much in society, right?
hmm,
And on on top of the, like, aspect of, like, okay, that's the wage that they get, it also translates to, okay, this is what you can do, how much you can kind of participate economically within society, right?
yeah,
So your job is saying that, uh whatever, you have the ability to take care of your needs, and then you have, uh whatever, a few things here and there that you get to spend on discretionarily, right?
yeah,
Like how you mentioned earlier, like Warhammer, right? If you wanted to buy a Warhammer, those are expensive models. They don't
yeah.
really serve any other purpose than your own enjoyment. Just
I
like
was
if
gonna
you
say
want to
that's like
go
the
get a
top tier of
drink.
my luxury list. That
Well,
goes
yeah,
up
I
with
was
like a
gonna say,
cruise. Yeah.
yeah, Yeah, fair enough. Warhammer is definitely not a cheap one. But right, like in the same way if you and I chose to go out to the bar and have a drink, right?
Yeah.
Not a necessity at any capacity
Yeah,
in our
like I
life.
could go and spend $60 and it probably shouldn't, but I'm not gonna like lose sleep if I do either, right? Like
Yeah,
I'm
right?
not
So
gonna like not I'm not gonna miss my rent or go
yeah,
hungry
you're
kind of
not
thing.
putting it
Yeah.
on credit and trying to like delay payments or something like that just to be
Yeah.
able to enjoy yourself. So your job has said, okay, yeah, you're allowed to have a little bit of enjoyment based off of what we pay you, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to get at, right? Like where um if the only dollar value you had was basically,
Your expenditures.
well, the only money that you actually got to see was the stuff that you wanted to kind of like
That's what I
get to
mean. Yeah.
spend your
Like the
money
stuff
for,
you
like the
wanted.
fun side of things. Yeah.
Yeah.
um would you be okay with that? And I know that that's like a very, I think a very tricky
Yeah. In
situation,
a
right? Like,
perfect world, probably.
and and
Yeah.
and I think that that's fair. I think the issue, I think some people would tell you or say, um, is that removes all sense of choice,
Well, yeah, that's
right?
my biggest hang up with it, right? Is like your time is still your time at the end of the day.
What do you mean
But
by that?
like
Like
well, like in
relative
terms of
to,
your labor,
yeah. I guess what
right? So
I'm trying to ask is like, and these are extreme hypotheticals that don't like it's
yeah.
it's not to necessarily say like that's what the reality that you
No, but
necessarily
if our
want.
government was
It's
like the Federation in Star Trek, I wouldn't have a problem with that.
yeah, if you actually believed in
Yeah,
that
like
they're
if
not
that was
trying
how it
to
was
mess with you.
practiced in theory, like yeah, or sorry, I thought theory was put into practice that way. Like yeah, like do what you guys need to do. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
and then just
Okay.
give me what I need to for like that and that. What? Oh my god.
In that sense. Yeah, yeah. No, I know what
In
you're
that
saying.
scenario, yeah,
Yep. No, and I think that I hope that others would also feel that way, not necessarily looking at what governments are currently like, but if you had a government that actually genuinely cared about you, that understood what people need to survive in life, um, and then provided those things, that people would be fine with a more collectivist style of living, right? Um, because but there's a lot of kind of qualifying questions before that ever becomes like a reality, right?
yeah, but
Um,
just hypothetically, right? So
on the basis of, yeah,
yeah,
if you could have a situation, right? Because that's really kind of getting back down to the idea of, should you raise taxes, should you lower taxes, should you, right? It really comes back to the heart of this idea of, should you as an individual get to choose everything that you're purchasing, right? Whether you, it means that you can afford like less or more type of thing. Well, arguably, you'd probably afford less if it's on your own, but you would have the
yeah,
choice. Or would you have, like, technically speaking, slightly less choice, but you overall could afford more, right? That's really
mm,
at the heart of the conversation when you're looking at taxes in general, right? We can look at individual taxes, whether it's like like we've been talking a lot about income taxes earlier. We talked about sales
consumer,
tax, like
yeah,
consumer
yeah,
taxes, right? You can look at the nitty gritty of those things, but I guess kind of relating back to that reasons for why we have taxes in the first place, asking ourselves, are we, what kind of general world scenario do you want? Do you want a little bit more, but a little less choice? Or do you want like full choice, but maybe you're not getting as much out of the system?
yeah.
Right. Um, and I don't
Interesting
think
to
it's like
see
a
that.
simple answer,
No,
yes or
yeah, I'm sure
no.
everyone's gonna come from a slightly different, but it'd be interesting, you know,
Mm-hmm.
just to see what other people's
Yeah,
takes on it would
whatever
be,
people hear. Yeah,
because I feel like you get a broad spectrum of stuff from a wide range of like skills, right?
100%. And I think that there's the other aspect that kind of comes into play is that if you're focusing on this from more of an individualistic standpoint, you may look at your own personal finances and say, one way or the other, right? If you are
Hmm.
not making a lot of money, you're like, sure, sign me up for a system that's going to take care of me. And I'm not going to have to be like, where's my next meal coming from? Where's
Yeah,
my, like,
the
am I going to pay the
heating.
water
Yeah,
bill? Right. Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Like, you're going to say, sure. And then you have the flip side. If you have someone who's like, well, no, I work really hard for my job. Like, whatever, I went to school, or I worked up the ranks within the company, and I make a lot of money and I take care of myself. So why should I be shelling out more for, like, less choice? But also, not only that, but the reality is um in a system that has taxes for the purposes of socially taking care of each other, you naturally are going to be like how we still are already are today. We pay into things that we don't necessarily have the benefit of, right? If you're extremely wealthy, you still pay taxes, right? And you are not going to utilize whatever 80% of the things that government spend taxes on, right? So if that's the case, oh my gosh, we've lost Jordan again. Technical issues once again. But hopefully that makes sense for everyone, right? This idea that if we have a situation where you could pay more into taxes and then society as a whole gets more, again, qualifying that government is able to spend that money properly, or maybe more transparently, right? With a little bit more of your say, especially when we live in a democracy, right? Um, could you would you agree with a system that is like that, or are you still on the fence of like, you know what, no matter what, I always think that taxes should be as little as possible because I will figure out my own way, right? It's an interesting conversation. Hopefully it's one that you guys, at least if you haven't thought about it before, maybe you're thinking about it now that we're talking about it today. um but hopefully next time we won't have as many technical issues as well, and we can finish a podcast without any interruptions. But like I said, hopefully you've learned something. Hopefully you've gotten a sense of not only just like the ideas around why we have taxes in the first place, but also kind of really the intricacies of taxes, and how there's so many moving parts. There's so many different ways that you can tax people. Um, there's questions around what you're spending that tax dollars on, right? Case in point, in Canada, we spend money on healthcare. In the United States, they don't do that as much, right? They've only recently started to do those things. Um, there's so many different ways to look at these things, but it is kind of at the core of what you psychologically feel is important, um, for your life. And and Jordan's back, but nevertheless, Jordan, I basically am wrapping this up because I feel like we can only handle so much technical
yeah. We
issues.
almost
Uh,
started a fire there.
oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Well, I think on that note, it's safe to say, hopefully this episode turns out, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully you learned something. Like everything, we're going to continue these conversations. They'll become a little clearer the more that we talk about them. But yeah,
And I'm sure
uh,
taxes it's going to come up again
oh,
quite a bit.
100%. Yeah, I even
Yeah,
just
yeah.
just got over saying that it's so intricate. There's so many different ways to like navigate it, in terms of the different pieces that are involved
Pieces.
with
Yeah,
it,
there's
right?
so many moving parts, right?
Yeah, right.
It's
I
very difficult to like put everything into under one scope and
definitely,
just yeah.
and I've said this to you, like, right, like my brain spirals when it comes to the, well, many of our conversations, let's be honest, but taxes in particular, because I know quite a bit about how the different parts of taxes work, but
Yeah.
it's very hard to isolate your conversation focusing on just one type of tax or one scenario taxes, because
Well, yeah, even just like 5 minutes ago,
yeah,
like we were talking before the technical issues and I wasn't understanding the way you were trying to lay it out. until we
Yeah.
came back
Yeah.
from,
Yeah.
and I was like, oh, okay, well, you put it that way. There's so many ways you can look at it, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's that's what makes it so interesting, though. I think, right, is like there's so many ways to approach it,
Yeah.
and there's a lot you can do with it.
Yeah. A lot you can do with it. And I think that there is an interesting way to say that, like there is and there isn't a right or wrong way when talking about taxes, right? Because there, you can have a situation that if like whatever, if you had really high taxes, right, but the government's not spending them well, then that's a horrible situation. But if you have really high taxes and they take care of you, then that's great. You can have the flip side. You can have really, really low taxes or no taxes at all. And you have kind of mass poverty because of that, because there's no social welfare and there's no institutions that are taking care
Or
of
just like
people.
no institutional funding in general.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
yeah,
Which historically you can find that, right? Like you could, that is uh a lot of history is related to that type of idea where most people had nothing. Most people were kind of bottom of the barrel,
barrel.
peasant
Yeah,
oriented, no social services, no healthcare, whatever, right? But you can also just as well have a situation that has no taxes or whatever, very few taxes, where people are able to thrive, right?
thrive. Yeah.
Um, so
What's
it
that
is,
little country? Monaco, the little one. France.
yeah, yeah,
No.
yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's one of those. But
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
with low taxes, yeah, sure.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, it's hard, but I would make the argument that even with taxes, like everything we've probably talked about on this channel and will continue to talk about, um, taxes are one piece of the puzzle, right?
yes, yeah.
So it doesn't fix everything. You can tweak the
No,
tax
yeah.
code and that doesn't change half of the
Change anything.
situation,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah. I was watching
Um,
a video the other day. I guess the guy like he researches like he does something with the homeless,
okay.
and he's like it's and it just the way you described it, Pop, the way he described it, he's like, well, sure. He's like, how do you think you would start solving the problems? Like, get them all into houses, okay? But then that only peels back one layer,
Yes.
and then
Yeah.
there's like another layer to peel back, and another layer to peel back, and that's what
Yeah.
makes this stuff so interesting for me, right?
Yeah. And I hope, I feel like that's such a great point. I'm glad that you bring that up because I do talk about that all the time. That's
Yeah,
half my
terrible
stress.
Shrek reference, but yeah,
Yeah, the onion.
onions have layers.
Ogres are like onions. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I am glad that you brought that up because I know I've said this to you a lot. Like it does. I always find it difficult to have any of our conversations because I know deep down that you kind of have to have all this information and focus on so many different areas
Little
to really
nuances and
understand it or really
aspects,
to like, yeah,
or just
deal
even
with the issues.
appreciate it. Yeah, or just
Yeah,
grasp, like
right.
just grasp it.
Yeah, it's hard to approach any of this stuff well
Yeah,
just looking at like taxes or just looking at
in such a
democracy or whatever.
yeah. But then
Yeah,
it's like
right.
taking all those little pieces, right? And
Yeah, and that's our hope, right? We're going to
yes,
build a bit of a catalog here in our beginning, and we've said this before. We build it up where you have a bunch of different kind of singular topics,
topics.
and then from those topics, we're going to have a situation where we can actually then, okay, let's look at this a little bit more big picture. You have some background information. Let's see what we can do and how we can kind of fix or approach the different
Work it
issues
out.
that we think
Yeah,
are plaguing society, so to speak.
yeah,
But yeah, I think on that note, Jordan, thanks for the chat.
yeah. No, thanks for waiting for me.
Yeah, no worries. Hopefully, hopefully
What I learned today
the
is I'm
power
going to have to
surging.
go to Best Buy now. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not sponsored, but Best Buy. No.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm coming to give you some money.
Yeah. But yes, as always, I'm Braden. He's Jordan. We are the Realist Idealists, and this is Powerview.